All right, thanks so much, Erica. So everyone, it's nice to meet you. As Erica mentioned, my name is Riley Jones, the co-founder of Sector Software and also an alum of the NYC Media Lab Combine Accelerator. We've got an amazing panel planned for you all today. We've got Dr. Karina Alexanyan, Dr. Savannah Tace, and Albert Cahn, really to talk about the state of surveillance tech and ways to be responsible, what's happening, and what things we'd like to see change. And so with that, I'll kick it off to the panel to do some quick introductions, and we can go Karina, Savannah, and Albert.
Hi, my name is Karina Alexanyan. I run a consulting firm called Humanication. I'm a social scientist and a journalist, and with about 15 plus years of expertise in social impact of communications. I have a degree in journalism from Columbia. I've worked with the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. At Stanford, I work with a group called Media X that did industry academic partnerships in human sciences and computer interaction. I worked with an organization called Partnership on AI, and currently I'm consulting for a number of groups, including All Tech is Human and a group called Me2B Alliance that work in responsible and respectful technology. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Savannah?
Yeah, I'm Savannah Tace. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton University in research computing. My background is originally in computational physics, but now I do research on algorithms, how they learn about things, how we can enforce fairness better into these systems, and then also the intersection of the development of these systems with policy and equity concerns.
Awesome. And Albert?
Hello, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here. My name is Albert Fox-Cahn. I'm the founder and executive director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. We're a New York-based privacy and civil rights group that looks at the way that artificial intelligence and surveillance technologies are being used by state and local government. I also am a fellow at NYU Law School's Engelberg Center on Innovation Law. I'm a fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project, where I've been doing a lot of work around smart cities and remote proctoring work. I'm also a fellow with Ashoka and the Day One Project. My law degree is from Harvard, and I have the misfortune of being a one-time philosophy major who is engaging in these discussions around surveillance and AI, but really such a pleasure to join you here today.
That's great. Thanks so much, Albert. So, just to kick it off, obviously the panelists, you all know that data is an ever increasing component of things around policy and discussions around policy at both the federal and local levels. And it also seems to be a prominent mode of data capture, especially in areas that deal with the public welfare. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the state of surveillance tech and policing and healthcare and education. And I know you all have various experiences in those respective areas. So maybe we can start with Karina, and maybe your thoughts on education and the state of surveillance tech.
Sure. And, I'm happy to talk about it. Might be better to have Albert go first and go the other way around, because my take on it is a little bit sort of non-standard. So if that's okay with you, Riley, can we?
Yeah, go for it.
A little bit?
Albert.
Yeah.
Well, I have the sort of the joy of playing the role of the fly in the ointment, the person who is always saying, don't use this tech. And I think that has never been truer than what we see with educational surveillance right now. We've done a lot of work on the role of remote proctoring and surveilling students' most intimate moments, putting remote webcams in their homes that are reviewed by human beings, but also by algorithms that are often biased, particularly against students of color. And really, we see this expansion of this new form of the surveillance state, but without any real justification that it serves the broader pedagogical goals of helping actually teach children and actually helping provide an accurate, form of assessment. And so we've been working quite a bit with different partners to push back against it. Advocacy campaigns, we're exploring litigation against it. And it's something that really we view as one of the most dramatically increasing forms of surveillance in the United States. But since you mentioned policing as well, I have to mention that we are actively working to ban a number of the police technologies that are being used in this space. Facial recognition, for example, we are pushing legislation here in New York City and New York State that would ban it categorically when used by government. We're also looking for bans on police drones, bans on a number of other forms of police monitoring, such as social media monitoring. And I think it really gets to the core of our work that oftentimes we don't see a viable regulatory path for these technologies, given the type of dangers they pose and the difficulty of having a robust and resilient regulatory structure over time. And so our solution oftentimes is just to work with our coalitions to try to outlaw it.
That's a great point, Albert. And just to stay with you just for a sec, I think, one of the things that is really interesting, we talked about this earlier today. You're a lawyer. I happen to be a lawyer too. It sounds like you're saying there's really a theory in the law or in legislation and regulation that people can actually advance to make sure that, this encroachment on their lives, they can kind of fight back.
That basically the law has categorically failed to keep up with these systems. We have this default presumption in American legal system that essentially police can use these technologies unless they're banned from using them. That it essentially creates a default presumption in favor of expanded surveillance. We see a growing movement around the country through community control of police surveillance laws, where it's actually trying to flip that logic. But unfortunately, that is only a small fraction of the towns and cities across the country that have gone down that path so far. And so really right now, we view it as a twofold fight: banning the worst offenders and trying to invert that general presumption in favor of state-based surveillance.
Got it. That's great. And maybe now we can go to Savannah. I know that you have experience with this in healthcare. What's your take on the state of surveillance tech in that realm?
So I think there's I tend to look at two components. There's a lot of what Albert was mentioning at the beginning of a lot of these algorithms are not really proven to do the things that they're kind of advertised as doing. A lot of these kind of purposes we want them to serve are very nebulous and very hard to quantify, and particularly in healthcare, but also in policing and education, you need a very long-term kind of assessment to see if they're actually serving the purposes that you want them to serve. Right? Like if you are trying to improve a health outcome with some kind of data collection algorithm and then some kind of automated decision system, you need, years of trials to see if that actually is coming into effect. And we often just deploy these systems after some amount of in development tests, not deployed in the real world, just developed by whatever company is developing these algorithms. So I do a lot of work in that space at looking at is it even possible to try to quantify the outcomes that we want from these systems? Because in order to develop an algorithm, you have to kind of create a mathematical descriptor of the outcome that you want. And in a lot of these societal impact spaces, that's actually very hard to do. And then the other thing I think about a lot is where different ways that inequities come into these pipelines outside of even the initial algorithmic development. So looking at who these systems are deployed in, we've seen that in all of these spaces, healthcare, policing, education, and many others, where these kind of surveillance capture systems are deployed, they're often deployed in already marginalized communities that sometimes don't have the technical knowledge to understand the data capture systems that are being used, what the data is going to be used for, and are not given the chance to opt in. Again, like Albert was mentioning, it's kind of the default that this kind of data capture is allowed, and it can be used for kind of whatever nebulous purpose the companies or organizations developing these systems want them to be used for. I think I can pause there for now.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. And Karina, how would you like to chime in?
Thanks so much, Riley, and thanks for indulging me about kind of switching the order. So the work that I do on there's kind of like the spectrum. There's sort of like the work that Albert and Savannah does that is, maybe you would call it kind of more overt surveillance, where you know that there is some ostensible social purpose for your being observed, whether it's, public safety or for the benefit of health or whatever. There's also a whole other layer, and that's the layer that's going on every time you interact with a technology and your information is being gathered, and you may or may not know how it's being gathered and how it's being used. And this is more of like the privacy and safety layer. That's more the layer that I work in, and for instance, or my work with Me to Be Alliance. And what they're doing is kind of interesting. They're developing, their take on it is your relationship with your technology. It's not just a tool, it's a relationship, and the relationship should be respectful. So they've kind of done this like interesting twist or shift from just responsible technology, which is you have to be kind of as the tool builder, cognizant of the social impacts and social implications of what you're doing, and kind of incorporate those into the building of the tool. Respectful technology is more like the user and the product or service have a relationship, and the information that is being shared should be done so in a respectful way. And they're creating a standard and a metric sort of for quantifying this, and then they're auditing organizations, products, not organizations, but the behavior of products and tools in terms of how they do that. And recently they came out, speaking about education, they came out with a report that reviewed really a random sample of nationwide of about 75 school apps. And they found that 60% of them were sharing student and user data with third parties. And so we chose school apps in particular because, that's where you really think you want to be safe. Like, in particular, you should not be collecting kids' info. And the companies that are building those are kind of billing themselves as this is what they do professionally. And yet 60% were sharing it with advertisers, and we're not making that information clear. So I guess what my point is that there's a whole spectrum of surveillance out there, and one way to and that respectful interaction is one way to think about it.
No, that's really helpful, and we can stick with you for a bit, just moving to our next topic, but I think is somewhat related. Like, how do diverse teams and having diverse teams, how does having them develop the technology influence the impact of surveillance tech? I think it was Albert that was talking about really being intentional about having different stakeholders involved. So are there ways you've seen people use stakeholder engagement or community engagement to broaden who informs the design and the implementation of surveillance technology systems?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One is groups like All Tech is Human are not, and this is my philosophy as well. Like, your tool is going to be better when you have a more diverse group of people building it. Just like simple as that, And by diverse, I mean not just like ethnic or cultural diversity, but if you,
exactly.
Social scientists, there's a lot of pressure on people with a computer science or an engineering background to now, on top of it, like slap a ton of social science knowledge, or like check off some social science boxes. And, on the other hand, you have people like Albert who have that like philosophy foundation. Like, I think philosophy is a phenomenal foundation for this kind of, social impact of tech work. And so if you have a team of people that includes people with a social science background, and very importantly, includes the people that are going to be affected by the technology, people who've had like what we call like sort of experiential experts, like people who've had it in their communities, you're just going to have a better tool. This is really what like the All Tech is Human mission is, and you guys can check it out. But another thing that speaks to the multiple stakeholder, I worked at a really interesting project at Partnership on AI on facial recognition. And Partnership on AI is a group that brings industry and civil society together. They're trying to do something incredibly challenging, where they have the builders of the tools talking to the people that are going to be affected by the tools. And they brought a bunch of people in a room to try to like create a report on facial recognition. And it was like a few months of meetings, like maybe 5 or 6 meetings. And ultimately how far we got was to really just describe what facial recognition is. Like we had to like start at the very, very, very basics. Like, how is facial recognition different from facial identification? What are the contexts? Like all the different things, like at least create a shared vocabulary. But one of the experiences that I found was really interesting. And you had like people from, the tech builders to these civil society groups all in one room. And we had someone from Detroit talking about there was a civil society organization in Detroit talking about some of the experiences that they had and the fights that are going on there in terms of facial recognition and police surveillance. And at the end of the meeting, most of us in the group were like horrified. They like couldn't believe the kind of things that, the extremes of what had been going on there. And he was like super enthusiastic and optimistic. He was so excited. There was a group of people in a room that were trying to, like, were even thinking about this problem, and that it wasn't like only his fight, and that we're trying to address it. And it just really brought home like the importance of having these conversations and not having these groups be siloed, and having, the civil society groups understand the technology, and having the technology groups understand the issues, because often they're not. That's like the conversation.
Communicating.
Yeah.
No, that's helpful. Well, Albert, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I know that you do some work with New Profit that is really intentional about cultivating groups of diverse leaders and that kind of thing. So what are your thoughts on really broadening out who's informing the development of systems?
Well, I think it's really impossible to talk about surveillance without talking about anti-racism work, community-led work as part of it. And I want to recognize the amazing groups on the ground all across the United States that are fighting these technologies in their local communities. People like Data for Black Lives, the Our Data Bodies Project. We've seen a number of groups out in California, Secure Justice, Oakland Privacy Commission, and there's so many individual groups that are taking the lead in their communities. And we have to recognize that while this is a global sort of discussion, and for some of us a global fight, it's unfolding in parallel at the ultra local level, community by community. And one of the things, I think that a lot of industry players have come a bit of a way in recognizing some of the obvious failures that have informed the direction of surveillance technology. They are recognizing that, yes, if you have all white design teams, you're going to end up with products that are, perpetuating really visible biases. But I think one of the problems is all too often we see, tech companies deciding that diversity is the way to build a better mousetrap, not a way to decide if we should be building this technology in the first place. And over and over and over again, we're being told by community partners that it's not that they want facial recognition to work better or to be less biased, or they don't want automated license plate readers to be more accurate. They just don't want this technology. And I think that there's so many incredible abolitionist groups. BYP 100 is one of the first that comes to mind. Media Justice, who keep trying to push back on the very premise that a lot of vendors are selling us on, that this surveillance technology actually promotes underlying security and safety for communities, particularly BIPOC communities. And recently I was rereading Ruha Benjamin's amazing book on race after technology, and just really her incredibly prescient critique that no, these technologies are not giving that baseline value of safety, let alone something that can counterbalance the harm that they perpetuate through bias. And that's why my group so often is calling for these technologies just not to be used at all. And I really appreciate a number of Karina's points, and especially the need to democratize this discourse by making sure that as many people as possible are taking part in these conversations, understand how this technology works. But I don't think it's just a matter of educating communities about the technology. I think all too often we're educating government stakeholders about the technology they're buying, because there's a lot of people who are buying technology from vendors.
Yeah.
That's basically just high-tech snake oil. And,
Yeah.
where they're buying invasive vaporware that perpetuates all of these harms, but really doesn't actually have the benefits to justify its deployment in the first place. I think Savannah was speaking to that as well earlier.
No, yeah, for sure. Savannah, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that kind of came to mind with the first part of this question of how does having more diverse teams impact the development of surveillance technology, I think the biggest fear maybe from some of the developer companies that want to sell this tech is that it would slow it down. Exactly like Albert was saying, these systems should be serving some kind of like measurable public interest purpose, right? Like if you're going to be collecting data from the public, it should be being used to serve them, right? But I think a lot of the cases that we've seen, it's being used instead to serve, systems of power that are exploitative, that are biased. Right, like predictive policing, we haven't seen that much evidence that it actually makes communities safer, but we have seen a lot of evidence that it can be used in very biased and very harmful ways. So some.
Oh no!
I think we lost her for a bit.
I just wanted to quickly say that when she was talking about slowing things down, I think that's so crucial, because the whole idea of move fast and break things doesn't really work when you're the person who's left picking up the pieces
or being broken.
Savannah, did we get you back? No worries. We'll come back when she's able to. Oh, are you back, Savannah?
Hi. Yes, sorry about that.
Go for it.
Right. No, I was just saying, some part of me has a sense that there's maybe a fear that bringing more people into this conversation is going to stop the kind of bullet train of surveillance technology development, which, some people think is maybe a good thing. I tend to be on that side. But, there's always profit incentives involved in these kind of developments too. But then kind of other thoughts on that question, like this is something that I care a lot about in my work, and that, the work of researchers that I really admire try to do is exactly what Albert was saying, of working with these organizations that are on the ground. So like if you're developing a system that's going to be used to do some certain kind of task or in some certain area, you should be talking to those stakeholders from day one. And with a lot of my public health work, like that's exactly what we do. We partner with specific organizations that work in those spaces, and we develop projects like with them. I don't really like the idea of doing research on communities without having like their explicit consent and involvement. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And then the aspect of diverse teams in general, exactly like both Karina and Albert were saying, is very important, from all kinds of backgrounds, educational backgrounds, topical backgrounds, cultural experiences, and then more of the like standard axes we think about of like race, gender, ethnicity, religion. Like all of these things are going to help you avoid the problems that we're seeing right now of you deploy a system and it causes some kind of harm. Like if you have people who have experienced this space or those kind of harms before, like you're less likely to cause more problems, right? Like you're more likely to catch it before you deploy it in the world. And yes, this is my cat.
Well, I'd love to ask a quick follow-up, and maybe both Karina and well, really all of you. I'm curious as to your thoughts on like the role that the academy, so universities, colleges. I know that NYC Media Lab does a ton of work, and with current students and recent graduate students, like what is the role of that institution, especially for those of you who still work with schools, in both developing that diverse pipeline, but also in kind of forcing these folks who really is where the companies are recruiting from, like forcing them to be a lot more ethical and thoughtful about the systems that they're building. And that's for any of you. Anybody want to chime in?
I guess I can go first. So I am still in academia, and my plan is to hopefully stay in academia. I think there is definitely a big role for academia to play in this space. Like, we can think about, I mean, this is where a lot of technologists are being trained. So we can think about how we can have more interdisciplinary education, so we can encourage, people in computer science or math, stats, to take real meaningful, like deep coursework on these issues, and the same thing in the other direction, so that people have kind of a breadth of knowledge. You can still focus in your specific area, but you're at least exposed to these ideas while you're learning about the technical side or the philosophical side, so you can kind of like develop your mindset and your research practice in that like interdisciplinary ecosystem. I don't want to get too off topic, but this is something that I think about a lot, is in technology. There's a really, I think, interesting kind of thing playing out in academia, that there's a lot of corporate tech influence in academic research in this space. Forget the exact statistic, but it's more than like 50% of academic, like within university computer science research, is in some way sponsored by a major tech company. So that's something else to keep in mind, I guess, in this space, is how we want that relationship to develop and change in the future, and what kind of space we want academia to be for this kind of work, and how independent it is, or we want it to be. But that could be a whole other panel.
For sure. Anybody else want to quickly chime in before we move on?
Well, I think it's really interesting that you say that, Savannah, because obviously it's true. And but one of the things I was saying is, I feel like it's almost a little siloed. Like, I see a lot of social science work in this sort of responsible technology space. And then living in Silicon Valley, I see people kind of like running around and building their products and doing their thing, and maybe like slapping on a little like checklist on top. But I haven't seen as much kind of cross conversation as I would like. I feel like those two groups could more now than before, but really could be, and they're a little bit at cross purposes. One person wants to make their product and get it to market as quickly as possible, and we'll see what happens later, kind of. And the other is like there for the long-term, long-haul, deep thinking. So, it makes sense. But in general, I would like to see more of people being able to speak each other's language, I guess.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. Albert, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most systemic failures of American higher education of the last, 30 years, and that is saying something, because there are a lot of failures in this space. But to me, it is morally indefensible that a doctor whose decision can harm a single patient takes an ethical oath, is bound by ethical duties, and yet the person who designs an algorithm or who trains a model that can make healthcare decisions for tens of thousands of people is completely outside that same sense of obligation. And I think that we should have that at a minimum ethical training for anyone who is designing this sort of technology. I think it's obligatory, but also I think that universities, even when they claim to be supporting a more noble vision for ethical technology, they are not practicing what they preach. We have seen, particularly during COVID-19, the rollout of invasive and discriminatory, health tracking technology that isn't actually working. Natasha Singer did great work just showing that colleges and universities had spent millions on it, and no one can actually show if it's stopped the spread of COVID-19 at all. And so whether it's the technology they use to track their employees, whether it's the technology they use to evaluate admission or to proctor their own students, if if universities want to be incubators for the ethical development of technology, they cannot continue to use the systems that reproduce and these same harms. To me, those are just completely at cross purposes.
And just quickly building on what Albert's saying, it's hard work to walk the talk. Like, I work with responsible technology, respectful technology nonprofits and startups, and gosh, we have to build a terms of service that's really transparent and clear, and we have to not use ads or cookies in our website. Well, how there's some information we'd like to get. How do we do that? How do we be transparent about what we're collecting, and how we could do it, but it takes a lot of work. And so, just, I don't know, in respect for people who kind of take the effort to walk the talk.
No, for sure. I appreciate that. And just to, I guess, take a bit of a different direction, coming from talking about the academy, the entire point of the Machines and Media Conference is really trying to humanize these discussions and make them more accessible. So I'm curious as to you all's thoughts, and we can start with Savannah. How do you think our listeners today can really better engage with this topic? Are there initiatives that you think are doing a good job? I know Albert and Karina have mentioned some, but I know you have some thoughts around, you mentioned like the technical knowledge gap. Are there ways you think that our listeners can better engage with this topic?
Yeah. Several thoughts. So one is I can mention some of my favorite resources. A lot of, I like all of the organizations that Karina and Albert have mentioned. I also follow AI Now very closely, and a lot of their research, because they often take this perspective, like I was saying before, of partnering directly with community organizations. So they've done really interesting work with like a Brooklyn housing project on a facial recognition system that was going to be used for like keyless entry in a housing project, and working directly with the tenants association to kind of discuss like how that tech works, how it's developed, where the problems of bias come into it, and then legal like recourse for that. And so they were able to like actually support the tenants association in a lawsuit that ended up preventing the facial recognition entry technology from being deployed in the housing system. So they have a lot of great reports and panels and all kinds of things that I think are very accessible and impactful there. And then I'll also mention Data and Society, which is another organization that I really admire and enjoy working with. And they do a lot of events kind of like this, like publicly accessible discussions that I think are really great educational opportunities. But the technical knowledge gap, I think, is something that needs to be addressed kind of from both directions. So like it's important for technologists to do outreach, to kind of explain what our research is, what our work is, like how it's being deployed in people's lives and society. But I think it's also, and maybe this isn't as relevant to the audience, I don't know who all is in the audience, but I think this is another thing that should be emphasized, like in the education side, when you're educating technologists, is how do you like do things in a way that's communicable and interpretable and like understandable. And, we like to think that like machine learning AI is so complex, so mathematical, like you need, a PhD to understand it. But really there are ways to break everything down into a way that can bring everyone into the conversation. So that's something else I advocate for, as well as like making technologists better communicators.
Yeah. Great. Albert, Karina, thoughts?
Sure. I think I mentioned, the Data and Society, absolutely. So much respect for them, and the Berkman Center. But the two organizations that come to mind in terms of like things people can be involved in right now are the two that I mentioned before. All Tech is Human is membership. They have a great like Slack community. They're just a really great evolving community platform, and they do webinars and all sorts of great things. And the Me2B Alliance, me2ba.org, is building a technical spec for respectful technology. And they're also a membership organization, and you can join and be part of a working group that's like developing that, which is, quantifying qualitative stuff is incredibly fascinating and incredibly difficult. And being part of that sort of ever-evolving process is super interesting. So those are the two I'd put plug in for.
And Albert, I know you mentioned Data for Black Lives. Any others that you think folks should take a look at?
Yeah, I could basically go on for an hour about amazing grassroots groups doing this work. Is one thing I really want to emphasize. It is something that's being done by all of these small groups and coalitions all around the country, around the world. Some folks whose work I really want to call out specifically. Dr. Chris Gillard, who's been really an incredible force on this topic. The work of DREC and Warriors in the Garden, an activist group here in New York that has done a lot to oppose facial recognition. Also, we haven't talked at all about the way that surveillance is weaponized against sex workers, and that's something that really has been a key driver of carceral surveillance in the United States. So I want to talk about the work of Hacking Hustling and Decoding Stigma, who have been doing incredible work to elevate the voices of sex workers, to talk about how a lot of the laws that have been passed in the names of supposedly protecting sex workers have actually put them in harm's way and with just horrific and tragic consequences. And I also wanted to, talk about, because I'm a lawyer and so everything goes through the legal lens, is just the work of a lot of the public defender groups as not just advocates against this technology on the front line. I'm specifically thinking of the Legal Aid Society here in New York that has an incredible digital forensics unit, but also as community-centered movement lawyers that are working to really push back against these systems and to humanize the cost in a way that few others can. So it really their work has been incredible.
No, thanks for sharing that. So we'll start taking some audience questions. The first one, it's reported that privacy is traded off for convenience, cookies, cameras, etc. Why don't we hear more about penalties and repercussions of wanting to one-click buy? Anybody want to chime in there?
Penalties and repercussions of just to click for convenience? Is that kind of what the question
exactly
is?
Yep. So exactly.
Yeah,
But consumers find it easy, but what are the repercussions?
Even just sort of working with the Me2B Alliance, I've been working in this space for years, but I'm going to out myself. I'm going to admit, you can make that stuff go away. You don't actually, I was always just fine cookies, whatever, moving on. You can just make it go away. And now I'm really judging the organization by their cookie policy. What does that look like? How nuanced can I get? Which one of those are not letting me out? Which one of those are, sort of pretending to give me a choice, but in the end, they have the opt-in button bigger than the you agreed to opt out of a bunch of things button, And yeah, absolutely. The discussion of what's happening with your information and what the repercussions are. To be honest, this is the kind of stuff that Me2B Alliance is doing. We're producing a series of educational reports that are kind of short briefs that whose purpose is to kind of explain this, here's what you think is happening, and here's what's the invisible universe. We call it the invisible dataverse of what's going on behind the scenes. Absolutely.
For sure. And go for it, Albert.
Oh, I was just going to say that when we talk about a lot of these trade-offs, we typically don't talk about privacy. Or if we do, we talk about it as the last in a series of harms because, when we're talking about, for example, if we're talking about one-click transactions, and there's a certain company that comes to mind, when I think about that firm's use of our data, it's not just, privacy for me, but it's, antitrust concerns. It's the accumulation of huge power, the ability to use that to really undermine, competition and in some ways potentially, endanger elements of democracy. That's the level of threat. It means empowering firms that potentially are using extractive methods to punish their workers and to deprive them of even the most minimal autonomy during the day. So I think that privacy is a part of it, but really when we're thinking about the dystopian storytelling of making people care about these choices, it's usually the last thing we want to talk about, not the first.
Totally. Savannah, you want to chime in?
Oh, I was just going to say I was reading about dark patterns a bunch just last night, and I was trying to find the article. I'll try to find it and share it, but there's a great article with a quiz about this practice. So dark patterns is exactly what Karina was saying, how you can kind of subtly manipulate people into taking actions with technology. So the making your unsubscribe process very, very difficult to find, whereas your sign up process is you can just link to your Google account and instantly, opt into sharing all of your Google data. That's actually a really interesting aspect of all of this too, is how, a lot of these big firms partner with other websites and other companies, so that then, everything you do online is tracked in one central space. But
so much data sharing.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the reason we don't see a lot of pushback on that is because it's not good. It's good for the companies to have these tricky processes, right? It's a good way to drive profits and additional purchasing and data collection that then you can more easily sell other places. So there's, a maybe conflict of interest between the consumer and the company that you're interacting with.
And actually, not to keep harping on this, but Me2B Alliance, our messages, it's actually good for both the business and the individual to treat each other, or mostly for the business, to treat the user with respect. You're going to have more trust and a better engagement with your product if you're transparent. I feel like Apple is going in that way with some of their new privacy policies, and so it's hopeful, or transparency policies. I mean, nothing's perfect, but that's kind of the message, that it's better for both. It's not necessarily in conflict.
No, for sure. So Karina, I'd like to stick with you because I do think I'm totally in your wheelhouse, because I know you've done research on, this topic in Russia. So how will countries with different ethics and values, particularly AI leaders in places like US and China, address the same issues? We first need to share common vocabulary and concepts.
It's a good question. It's really tricky. Authoritarian countries have, first of all, the whole concept of privacy to a certain degree is Western and American. Russian doesn't even have a word for privacy. Authoritarian countries view this sort of individual privacy in more collectivist. I'm making a bunch of huge sweeping generalizations, but just bear with me. Authoritarian or collectivist countries, the privacy is kind of less high on the pyramid of values, and there's more of the government will protect you from bad information, and we're going to share things for the good of all, and I'll trade my privacy for convenience, perhaps a couple of degrees more easily than somebody from the West with a little bit more of our cowboy whatever mentality. So those are huge sweeping generalizations and stereotypes, but absolutely there are cultural differences, and the values are not the same everywhere, which is why things like human rights, which have kind of a universal generally agreement, those are a really good place to start. So human rights towards using a human rights lens on technology ethics is a useful way to kind of get across some of those things.
Got it. Albert?
Yeah, I want to be frank that I get a little bit uncomfortable trying to distinguish the privacy norms between countries, just because I see such sweeping differences even within countries, within communities. It is something that is so fractured even within a single family. And so I think we see incredible groups on the ground fighting for, privacy protections, fighting against surveillance in so many forms, all across the globe. And we're working with partner groups in New Delhi, in Uganda, in Mongolia, and I think that really it isn't, we may not always have the same vocabulary, it may not always be expressed through the same cultural lens, but I think I don't think it is in any way a uniquely or even a distinctively American problem. I think that this is the defining sort of human rights challenge for the globe. I think it'll stay that way for the next generation. So I think that that's something that I just wanted to, even if there are governments that have normalized a degree of surveillance that goes beyond what we have here in the US, we should also acknowledge the fact that we in the US have normalized a degree of surveillance that would just be truly unthinkable in a variety of countries today. I mean, if you look at the level of surveillance in most OECD countries, we are a complete outlier from other states in what is considered acceptable. So I always try to highlight that, whenever we're trying to create this contrast between the U.S. and China, we are actually more alike than we are dissimilar in some ways.
No, for sure. Thank you for sharing that. So the other question that I had, and I know someone brought this up, Apple's kind of relatively new update really does potentially threaten the data sale business model of companies like Facebook and Amazon. Is this Apple's way of staying ahead of government regulation? Do you think Apple will set the global standard for all devices going forward? Especially, right, we're talking about that, countries might have ostensible differences in how they think about these things, but when you actually dig into it, sometimes they're a lot more similar than not. So do you think a company like Apple is actually trying to, again, set that global standard that will help them moving forward?
It's a very complicated question, right? I think there's a lot of different incentives going on there. So I guess maybe just to summarize, in case people aren't familiar, so Apple's new OS update requires apps on their platform. So Facebook was the one that got one of the ones that got a lot of attention, to require you to opt in to allowing your data to be tracked with a numerical identifier so that it can be shared across websites. So it's all technically anonymized already. They don't know what your name is, but they know what you do if you choose to share it, although it wasn't really a clear choice before. They know what you do on every single website. So that's how you get ads on Facebook for, things you were looking at on, I don't know, Gap or whatever website people look at. And so now after the new update, you're required to opt in to allow that sharing. And there was some Facebook study that I think estimated some very large proportion of people were going to choose not to opt in because why would you do that? And so I have thought about this a lot, and I think it's really interesting. The first thing I thought when this happened is that it's very interesting. I feel like this is what happened because we have kind of a legal vacuum in this space. And so now instead of having even a nationwide kind of policy on this, but ideally more of a global developed policy, we now have Apple stepping in and deciding this is kind of the way we're going to address these concerns. So it's quite interesting. I think for Apple, they definitely have been pushing to be seen more as the company, the tech company, one of the big six or whatever that actually cares about privacy. And I do think this is a great move. I really appreciate it. So I don't know how much they're trying to drive like the global kind of policy direction versus how much they're trying to position themselves as a company and like how they're viewed. But I do think it's maybe a little concerning that companies have so much impact in like the privacy and data collection space. Like we've seen that self-regulation amongst tech companies doesn't work that well off most of the time. So it's an interesting thing to watch unfold for sure.
If I could just add to that, I as always being the skeptic, I would want to point out that Apple can't be looked to as sort of setting a global standard when it uses different standards in different countries. And, Apple holds, its, data on Chinese users in China, in, the cryptographic keys is stored there, potentially allowing the Chinese government access. And so, it's selling, in that way, it's creating a very different model of what is considered privacy protective, for one of the largest set of its users anywhere on the globe. And so I think I sometimes wonder how much of the privacy focus from Apple is PR, especially given that in this instance, as a number of folks have written, when you make it harder for firms to monetize data to offer free services, it incentivizes firms to charge for their products instead. And when companies are charging for a download of an app rather than monetizing the data on that app, Apple gets a cut. So Apple gets a cut of every app sold in the App Store versus, when you're monetizing the data you get from that app, Apple doesn't receive any of those. So perhaps an overly jaded perspective.
That's such a good point, though. I mean, it's like you just watch it and you go, I want to believe that it's good, but how much of it is greenwashing, or whatever, privacy washing, whatever the term is. And then I think, Albert, that's such a good point. And what I was thinking about is, at the same time that this came out, there's like the Amazon Sidewalk thing that's like on my list of things to do to investigate. Something's happening where Amazon is like coming into my house and taking over somehow. Like today, I think, like that's how we hear about it. So if anybody wants to speak to that, that would be great because it's on my list of things to figure out.
I can give a quick overview. I'm in the middle of writing a report on this, but so for those of you who haven't been following, Amazon basically is rolling out a mesh network where a lot of their IoT devices, such as Ring home surveillance devices, Amazon Echoes, they will create this backup network so that if, for example, your Wi-Fi were to go out, they would be able to connect to your neighbor's Wi-Fi, and then supposedly they'll they'll be able to tunnel this data through the mesh network in a way that preserves your privacy. Open question mark if it actually lives up to the sales pitch. This has been very alarming to me from a antitrust perspective because it potentially enables dominant firms to now create a new proprietary physical layer of internet connectivity, just as we've seen them do with commercial platforms. And we've actually seen something very nascent and somewhat similar from Apple in their rollout of AirTags, which use the connectivity from the Find My Phone feature on Apple devices and ultra wideband to connect to nearby Apple devices to find an object, and so we could be going towards a splintering of proprietary mesh networks.
And it's opt out, not opt in, which is the key piece of that. Like, back to respectful treatment. What scenario in life in your interactions with people are opt out? Like all of a sudden you're just like physically picked up and teleported somewhere into a thing that, anyway.
No, that's great, and I think that's a great stopping point. Obviously, there's a lot developing in real time that we'll have to wait and see where it goes. But Karina, Savannah, Albert, you all have been great. This has been an awesome panel, and we are really thankful that for everyone who was able to join us today. So I will pass it back to Erica to tell you what's next. Take care.
Thank you so much, Riley. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.